This particular chapter in general psychology focuses on not only lifespan development, but basically squeezes a full 16-week course shrunk all the way down into one particular chapter. To say that you get a notion of the high spots is an understatement. But as we begin to poke our way through Chapter 9, I want to point out, at least tip my hat to specific types of research designs that are represented across the lifespan. When individuals are giving consideration for research issues related to the growth of the human species, they will often use what's called a cross-sectional design. They may also use a longitudinal design. Now, the cross-sectional design is a design that uses groups of individuals across specific sections of the population, just like it sounds. A longitudinal design is one that focuses on a particular group of individuals across an extended amount of time. One of the difficulties with longitudinal research is being able to keep up with the individuals that are a part of the research project, as well as keeping up with which ones of those individuals may have moved or even passed on, depending on the age of the group that's being researched. And lastly, you can also use biographical or retrospective designs, which basically means you're dealing with biographical issues related to a particular individual or a particular group of individuals that may or may not cross over the entire view of the lifespan. Now, this class is not concerned with any of the significant challenges related to research. I'm just going to give that to you for your information. But we are going to begin to unpack a little bit more material related to the beginning of life in the womb. And we'll start with prenatal development. Now, we all know from regular biology that it takes a sperm and an egg to create a zygote. Now, the zygote is the beginning place of the growth of a human person. Now, not just yet anyway. We're not going to get into some significant debate about at what point life begins or does not begin. I'll touch on that a bit in just a moment. But for the moment, just remember that the very first part of the creature that we call a human person exists during the first 2 weeks, is referred to as a zygote. The embryonic stage begins next and runs from 2 weeks after conception and runs up to about 2 months, give or take a little. Then the embryo moves into what's called the fetal stage, again at about 2 months after conception. That is the period of time in which the vital organs and the structures of the baby are going to form during that particular period, that fetal stage. Now, the important thing to remember for the fetal stage is the concept of the teratogen. Now, a teratogen is any substance that gets into the mother's system that could adversely affect the development of the child. It could deal with influencing poor development related to organs or other bone or blood structures, all kinds of possibilities. Now, there is a period of time during the fetal period, periods of time actually, that are called critical periods, and different teratogens may have different levels of influence on development depending on what type of critical period the baby is in during those particular times. German measles, for example, or nicotine, fetal alcohol syndrome, psychological stress are examples of teratogens and are all given to the baby through the experience of the mother. Smog, depending on where you live in a big city, a proper diet, alcohol's already been mentioned, any sort of other illicit substance use, anything along those lines that could be detrimental to the development of the baby is considered a teratogen. Now, it's perfectly well known that most of you at this particular stage of life in your college education are at least somewhat familiar with prenatal development and some of the delicacies that are a part of that process. It's pretty amazing, actually, that a stew of cells can develop into a person, somebody just like you, that happens to be sitting in a college chair or in a classroom or online for that matter, reading about this group of cells. But unfortunately, the process sometimes goes awry, and the manifestations of those disruptions can take on different forms. For example, one of the chromosomal difficulties that takes place occasionally in human development is Down syndrome. It's named after the doctor who first described its symptoms back in 1866. It's a disorder in which there is an extra chromosome within the body's cells. Now, this particular chromosome is associated with the 21st pair, which makes that a pair, that makes the pair then becomes a triplet. And the most common type of Down syndrome is called trisomy 21, meaning the three number 21 chromosome bodies. Now, the risk of having a child with Down syndrome increases greatly in women over the age of 35 or under the age of 18 who give birth. Symptoms include wide-set eyes with an almond shape and occasionally mental retardation. A better terminology for that would be some sort of intellectual disability of some kind. Now, other chromosomal disorders include Klinefelter syndrome, in which the 23rd set of sex chromosomes is XXY, with the extra X producing male with reduced masculine characteristics, enlarged breasts, obesity, and excessive height. Another disorder is called Turner's syndrome. In this disorder, the 23rd pair is missing an X, so that the result is a lone X chromosome, and these females tend to be very short, averaging approximately 4 feet 7 inches in height. They are usually infertile, and they tend not to develop the breast tissue and rounded hips that are typical of other girls in adolescence. Many Turner syndrome females have difficulty learning, especially in the areas of mathematics. Now again, we're just giving you a big scatter shot of prenatal concerns, which simply leads us into the area of the newborn. Now, newborns are born with a number of specific reflexes that they just do. For example, when a baby is born, a baby knows how to root. In other words, the baby will root around the mother's breast looking for lunch or dinner or other food. If the child is not breastfeeding, then the baby will root around looking for a bottle. The ability to suck or to nurse is part of what's inherent in the birthing of a baby. Children, when they're born, know how to swallow. Other facial expressions and the ability to imitate similar expressions are also present when a child is born. That's a list of a few of the reflexes. What some psychologists have discovered is that there are many types of reflexes that are present for which they have no reason. It's assumed that some evolutionary component was, at least at one time, associated with certain reflexes, and that particular need has evolved and is no longer necessary. There is always the temperament of the child to consider. Babies usually exist in 4 different categories. They're either considered easy babies, difficult babies, slow to warm up babies, or shy babies. Now, the fun part of that is that everybody wants to have an easy baby. I promise. Every young mother and every young parent wants to have an easy child to raise. But what we often end up with is a baby that has a combination of those different temperaments, and those temperaments may manifest depending on any particular situation. Depending on how the individual relates with other people, the child may be slow to warm up to others. The child may be overly shy simply because of how the child was raised early on. Again, some children are easy. My youngest child was an easy child. My oldest child was a difficult child. My youngest grandson is a very, very easy child. I've only seen him without a smile on his face one time in the entire first year he's been alive. The oldest grandchild, a little girl, just 3, she was a bit of a difficult child in her early raising, but as she ages, my suspicion is that she's going to be a little bit more problematic than at least her aunt was. So babies come with various personalities in a way, and they also have different sorts of perceptive abilities. For the newborn, vision is fairly fuzzy, actually. They can see, they can make out faces and certain facial features, but you have to be within extremely close proximity for the child to be able to do that. Newborns will also have preferences related to patterns. They will look at certain things or certain colors or certain people for longer periods of time. They often are more curious about complex color patterns. They will recognize faces and voices. Infants will always orient toward familiar faces and voices. If you walk up to a child who is familiar with your voice and the child is looking another way, when you speak, the child will turn in your general direction simply to let you know that the child is hearing, even if the child cannot comprehend exactly what it is you're saying. Newborns also have elements of depth perception. We've discovered over many years of research that infants do not care for what we call visual cliffs. One of the experiments that's involved here is that they put a child on a table, basically, that's glass. And so the child can see to the floor but won't fall. And they create a chasm of sorts in the middle of that table, and they put the mother on one side, and they get the mother to encourage the child to come across. In other words, to get over that particular chasm, always making sure there's no way for the baby to be hurt. But what they've discovered is that when children get to the edge of the chasm, they often are able to perceive the depth that's possible, and they're concerned for falling. As a result, they often will not cross over. Again, that's more for free. I'll try to pull up a video related to that. Again, it just depends on the children as well as the circumstances involved, how the child is raised from an early position, those sorts of ideas. In the infancy and childhood phases, we need to examine concepts related to neurological development. As the child ages, of course, synaptic density increases. A pruning process occurs thereafter. What that simply means is that as dendrites that are connected to the nerve cells are no longer required, the brain simply cuts them off. In a way, they atrophy, and as a result, the brain knows that they are no longer usable or necessary for use, so the brain simply trims them off, just like a vine dresser would trim vines in an orchard. Those things over time are not needed, the brain gets rid of them. Those types of processes over time will increase or decrease depending on the growth of the child and what's necessary. Physical and motor development is also quickly on the grow. Physical growth takes place in fits and starts rather than smoothly. Developmental norms provide average ages for particular milestones related to children, and simply because your child has not reached a specific sort of milestone at a particular quote-unquote average rate does not suggest that your child is disabled in any way. What that simply means is that your child is developing at a different rate. If, for example, children display a level of tardiness related to certain types of developmental concerns, there's the possibility of some sort of abnormality. It might warrant a little bit of explanation, but it certainly, on the average, should not cause any extreme duress. Motor development involves grasping, crawling, and walking. You'll discover that most small children will crawl with their hands beginning somewhere between 6 and 9 months. Certainly by the time they're a year old, most children will be not only crawling, if not already walking, depending on the childhood development. Now, Piaget created for us a unique understanding of children, but there are also a couple of challenges related to Piaget and his research. First of all, as an example, Piaget used his own children as research subjects. which is a no-no. It's when I say I'm going to use my family members for my research project, you know that just sounds kind of funny, and it was not helpful. But he put forth a theory related to cognitive development, and it is split into 4 different phases. There is the sensory motor phase, which is between infancy and 6 or 7 months. There is the pre-operational phase, there's the concrete operational phase, and then the formal phase of operation. Now, those have specific age connections put with them, which also is problematic from a theory perspective. What we discovered after Piaget is that, first of all, he often underestimated children's ability, and he also underestimated the ability for those categories to be somewhat more fluid. In other words, simply because a person enters the concrete operational stage at a specific number, an age, it's not an age range, we'll just say hypothetically that's the age of 10, that doesn't mean that all children do that. Some children may come in about 9, some may come in closer to 11. You just never know. There's a little bit of fluidity related to those boundaries. Again, the criticism related to Piaget is that he made those stages very discrete. There also is a greater awareness and understanding of children at earlier ages than he understood at that time. And then a gentleman by the name of Vygotsky offered a different view related to childhood development. When it came to moral development, which is more about emotions than it is about behavior, at least on the front end, Dr. Kohlberg proposed a stage model of moral development that included the pre-conventional stage, the conventional stage, and the post-conventional stage. The criticisms related to Kohlberg were that few people progress beyond the conventional stage. In other words, people don't develop fully. There are also cultural differences when it comes to moral values and moral concepts. And some individuals have even suggested that Kohlberg's approach is very sexist. In other words, it is prejudicial toward women. Now, again, some of those concerns are somewhat valid, others of them more or less so, but just be aware that different theorists have proposed different theories that perhaps will have particular challenges related to each one of them. Of course, as time progressed, people get a bit anxious and they want to speed up or slow down certain processes related to the human condition. People often asked Piaget back in the day whether it was possible to speed up cognitive development. Now, Piaget called this concern, quote unquote, the American question. Of course, Piaget was French. He said that Americans are always trying to hurry things along. And most researchers agree over time that such pressure is indeed detrimental if the child is not developmentally prepared to achieve it. Now, but others question Piaget's assumptions that children's cognitive capacities develop like the ripening of a peach and are largely unaffected by outside events. Now, if we were in the classroom, I would offer you a particular handout that asks you to identify 2 different benefits of encouraging, in other words, some of the advantages to encourage a child to develop faster, as well as some of the potential disadvantages. But for the sake of argument, I'll simply give them to you. Some advantages, or at least possible advantages for children to learn at a quicker rate, would be that the child might learn early in life to value intellectual skills such as reading and problem solving. Children may also be more likely to reach the more mature stages of cognitive development that many people are currently unable to reach. Children whose intellectual development is faster than average may do better in school and as a result have higher self-esteem. Any special talent a child has may be recognized earlier and therefore is more fully developed by specific training. Another possibility for good would be that a child would be better equipped to take advantage of educational resources at school and therefore better qualified for the professional level career. The extra stimulation might also enhance brain development and give a child an edge later on. Those are valid pros, to use that word, pros and cons, to use the word pro for earlier and quicker cognitive development. However, there are also as big a list of potential disadvantages. A child, for example, might feel overly stressed and pressured by parents or teachers or other grown-ups of any sort to be perfect, and as a result actually learn to dislike intellectual pursuits. A child might start to feel that he or she is simply a possession that the parents want to show off, and then esteem may also suffer. Parents may push children to accomplish things for which they are not developmentally ready, and everyone may be frustrated at that point. Children may also be busy, quote unquote, speeding up, and as a part of that process, they might miss out on important developmental tasks related to childhood through normal, unstructured play. Children might lose the intrinsic pleasures of learning for the sake of learning. And parents may also become psychologically invested in a child's intellectual success, so much so that they communicate, whether subtly or not so subtly, that a child is inadequate if the child lets them down, as it were. I'm sure most of us, at some level or other, have dealt with our own parents or caregivers when they have tried to, quote unquote, encourage us to develop either quicker or to be more efficient as a part of our learning. And if you can remember back to your own experiences of such times, what you thought about it, perhaps it will alter what it is you think might or might not be most appropriate in the development of your own children. Now, what about language? In the previous chapter, we referenced the building blocks of language, but as children, just after birth, begin, of course, their development, they move through different stages of language construction. The very earliest aspects of speech are simply babbling. Caregivers will show, demonstrate, mimic what we call infant-directed speech. Infants will provide you with one-word speech. They'll also use what's called telegraphic speech. Now, I may ruffle a few feathers here in what I'm about to say next, but if you want a child to learn how to speak correctly and efficiently, it's important that you speak correctly and efficiently with your children. To speak baby talk with children will in no way keep them at the lower stage of language development. In fact, it's possible, however limited in the possibility, that you could hinder language development by continuing to speak baby talk with your children. Just as a possibility, speak to children like you would anybody else, and children will develop the ability to speak in a similar way. There are theories of language development. Skinner said that there was not much support for a strictly behaviorist model of language acquisition. Noam Chomsky suggested that there was what he called a language acquisition device. And what that means is that somewhere between 24 and 36 months, something occurs in the brain of a child. It's almost like a switch gets flipped. You wake up one morning and your child looks at you and says, "Mother, may I please have my breakfast?" Just as plain as you might be speaking to some other adult. The day before that, they couldn't get 3 words together just so, but all of a sudden they wake up one day and they have this miraculous ability to speak. That's because, according to Chomsky and his theory, that this quote unquote language acquisition device was turned on somehow or other. Pinker, on the other hand, said that language instincts are shaped by forces of evolution, which is always to give credit to evolution is always going to be one of the ways that you can provide some kind of theory. Now, for those of you who speak more than one language, which language did you learn first? Is it your native language? For those of you of Latino or Latina descent, do you speak Spanish at home? Do you know how to speak Spanish at all? Bilingualism is not only up and coming, but extremely prominent in today's culture. If you want a child to learn more than one language, teach them early. Those of us who had to learn a different language in school did not do so until high school. It's far, far easier for children to learn more than one language when they're very young, when their brains are much more plastic and able to be molded. So if you want your children to speak in more than one language, give them access to that language at a far earlier age. How about socially? Of course, development takes place in different stages on a social level as well. When it comes to attachment, attachment is the formal definition of how individuals relate with their significant caregivers and individuals around them. Children develop what's called a relational attachment style. In other words, they discern for themselves as very small children to what degree their caregivers are trustworthy and reliable, and as a result they develop certain styles of connecting so that they either forge better or worse relationships. Now, secure attachment, such a child who has a secure attachment is able to sit by him or herself, is not prone to be overly stressed when the caregiver leaves. Other types of attachment would include avoidant, which is also another simple way of saying unattached. Those children often come from somewhat abusive circumstances. Ambivalent attachment is also referred to as insecure attachment. Those folks can be in relationship with you or not, basically. There's also what's called disorganized or disoriented, which is an insecure type of attachment that is also associated with individuals who have been abused or neglected. Now, for your own reading pleasure and your own curiosity, take a look at those different types of attachment. If you know or get a quick, a down and dirty assessment of some sort online, there's all kinds of ways you can assess attachment style. It'll give you a little bit of information about how it is you relate with other people. My relational style, for example, tends to be a little more disorganized. At the very least, it's going to be ambivalent. I am able to be in a relationship or not, depending on the number of people involved in a relationship. The more is not always the better or the merrier. The more people there are, the more emotional energy it requires for me to stay in relationship with all of them. As a result, I'm prone to emotional setbacks in that regard. But because I'm aware of how it is I relate to other people, I can also compensate for those relational challenges and make do. Just again, more of an idea about the possibilities of being able to navigate relationships. Now, Erikson proposed a theory of social development in which there are a handful of various stages that are going to capture age ranges. The very first stage of Erikson's developmental model is trust versus mistrust, and that is when children are discerning for themselves whether or not their caregivers are trustworthy. Will they take care of them? Will they change their diapers when they need to be changed? Will they provide food when it's necessary? How about shelter, love, care, and concern? If children don't receive those things as infants, their trust levels suffer. When very small children don't possess enough trust with their caregivers, it also strongly influences poorly adaptive relational styles. The next stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. What that simply means is you are encountering a small child, a toddler by now, who wants to do it himself or herself. They want to be left alone to do their own thing, whatever that happens to be. And what often happens with parents, especially younger parents, is that they inadvertently shame and create doubt for those children when they don't get what it is they want to do for themselves done correctly. It's a growing process for children. Give them some room, both literally and figuratively, to develop how they need to develop. The third stage is initiative versus guilt. That's when, again, children are expressing their own autonomy. Also, they experience being made, quote unquote, made to feel guilty when they don't get it right. Industry versus inferiority, that is younger adulthood, and that is when people are deciding for themselves to what extent they're able to be productive in culture. That's when we develop the inferiority complex, if we develop such things. Now, the remaining stages take place over adolescence and through old age and dying, and we're not going to unpack those just yet. We'll get to those another time. When it comes to parenting, there are 4 different styles of parenting, and one of them is better than the other 3. and I'll mention that. The authoritative parent. The authoritative parent wants the child to do what he or she says, no question. Do what I say. The authoritative parent also offers no explanation to the child for why he is or she is dictating to the child what to do or not to do. The authoritarian parent is the parent that sets firm boundaries, but is also willing to discuss within reason why it is those boundaries or requirements are necessary. It's not that you ask for permission to parent in a certain way. You just parent a specific sort of boundary laying way and empower the child to be able to communicate with you about that. The permissive or indifferent parent doesn't do well with parental boundaries. Those children are the ones that you experience that are beginning to be at least somewhat out of control. The permissive and indulgent parent has absolutely no boundary related to their children, and that is when you see children, in my language, acting very foolish. In the plainest way I know, that's when children act a fool. Had a conversation with a young lady just the other day. I say young lady, she's 29, has 4 children from 6 months of age up to the age of 11. The 11-year-old is giving her all kinds of extra grief. Now, there are a couple of pieces of information that are important as a backstory. The mother has a couple of cognitive challenges. She has an intellectual disability. That does not mean that she cannot care for her children. She does very well taking care of her children. But her oldest child, the daughter, is extremely strong-willed. As a result, she also has forged a relationship with her grandmother in which the child and the grandmother team up against the mother, which is not a good way to parent, by the way. And as a result, it creates all kinds of relational challenges in the family. Now, the mother tends to be a little more authoritative. Do what I say because I said. In this particular case, that type of parenting style is not going to be helpful. As a result, what she tends to do, because she does not have all of the cognitive skills that many of us possess, is that she becomes very indifferent and permissive without the ability to establish any boundary. And I promise you, even when children misbehave, they would rather have poor attention from a caregiver than no attention at all. And they will do what's necessary to receive attention from you. And this child does that. She is just on the edge of becoming physically aggressive with her parents, with her mother. And as a result, that mother will be compelled at some point to take a higher level of action. If you are a parent and you have a child who is physically aggressive with you, the first, although it may be the most difficult decision for you to make, is if it's necessary, you call 911. A child has to know what his or her boundaries are. They have to know where the fence row is so that they know how to behave in culture and in society. A child cannot be left to his or her own device for extended amounts of time. They have to have levels of boundaries. How you parent is not whether or not you're a better or a worse or a great person. It's about how you establish relationships and about how it is you enforce those boundaries you try to set with your children. Peers, your children and their peers and their other friends also influence the child's ability to relate well, especially in the social context. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't make at least the quiet head nod to sexual role development when it comes to development in children. Gender, for example, refers to the psychological aspects of being female or male. Gender roles is the culture's expectation for a male or female behavior. Gender typing is the process by which people learn appropriate gender role behaviors. And gender identity is a person's sense of being male or female. Now, This is extremely important. The way that's worded, it suggests that there is there are elements of physical there are physical elements related to gender and or sex development. That is true, but only as it relates to specific types of behavior. Again, culture is going to decide what is appropriate for males to do in comparison to what's appropriate for females to do, how they behave, the cultural expectation. Gender as a whole refers to the aspects of being male or female. A person's sex is male or female. There's not any other option unless you happen to be born with more than one set of sexual organs. And again, the identity is related to gender, which again is not a biological construct. Again, just be mindful of those things and how people often misuse them in the current cultural conversation. What about adolescence? Adolescence can be a challenging time for parents. Your children, just before they move into adolescence, will begin to experience all kinds of physical challenges and changes. Puberty is about 4 years during which the sex organs and the remaining sexual systems fully mature. There'll be secondary sexual characteristics and growth spurts will occur. Adolescent sexual activity, there is a significant sexual difference in experience and interpretation. Teen pregnancy is still a cultural concern, and the capacity to reproduce will sometimes bring the reality of reproduction. I have read of little girls as young as 10 birthing children, which means that child would have had to have been sexually active at the age of 9. Carry a baby to term, then birth a baby. Teenage brains are just that. They're teenaged. I don't know if you remember exactly how you thought when you were a younger teenager, but you didn't always do it well. Teenage brains change over time. Your brain will not fully develop completely until will not be finished anyway, until about age 25, plus or minus a little bit. The significant cognitive change that takes place in adolescence is the uncovering of egocentric behavior. The child becomes very self-focused and is usually not as able to consider the opinion of another person. Now, what about research as it relates to adolescence as a period of storm and stress? Children are often given a bad rap for the terrible 2s or the troubling 3s or whatever else, simply because children are trying to figure out how it is to navigate their world. Something similar occurs with adolescence, and people will tell you that the teenage years are horrible. You know what? They're only as horrible as you create them to be. When it comes to personality and social development, there are elements of storm, there are elements of stress. For Ericksonian stages, it's the identity versus role confusion stage. Relationships with peers happen to be more oriented towards same-sex groups as younger adolescents, and they give way to mixed sexual groups, which again is making reference to male and female groups. Relationships with parents in early adolescence specifically tends to be the lowest point of the parent-child or caregiver-child relationship. Some of the challenges that come up in adolescence would include the decline in self-esteem, depression, and potential suicide. There's also the consideration of youth violence. Biology, as well as one's context or environment, plays a role in that particular idea. All kinds of fun stuff. Adulthood. When we're unpacking issues related to adulthood, you need to be aware of personality traits. This particular stage of life development is when we experience greater maturity, confidence, warmth, and emotional stability. Some people ask, is personality genetically determined? The short answer is sort of. There will be rewards and internalization that are surely in play in the development of personality stability across time. When it comes to love, partnerships, and parenting, be aware that at least 80% of all Americans will eventually marry, although there are partnerships of various types that are increasing and are very common. Parenting can present a challenge for many adults, and the decision to end a relationship, just so you know, is more often than not a mutual agreement. Often when it comes to ending a relationship, it's simply one person deciding they're going to vacate. Now, in the world of work, there are career options that abound for people who enter adulthood. Dual career families are increasingly the norm. The majority of households I know about, both parents or both caregivers are at work, whether they're married or not. When it comes to the developing cognitive adjustments, as we age, reaction time slows down, but intelligence and memory remain relatively stable. During midlife, psychological health generally improves. Midlife crises and midlife transitions can present certain challenges depending on the person. Have you ever heard of the middle-aged man who decides to divorce his wife looking for a younger model, as it were, and goes and buys a red sports car that's a convertible? That's a guy who's experienced a little bit of distress. I've known more than one. They happened to move through that particular challenge relatively unscathed, eventually got rid of the sports car and settled back down. It wasn't that the man decided he wanted a new wife. He just was unsatisfied in life in general. But over time, he settled himself down and remains very married and is continuing to develop. He is 58. Now, as we move into late adulthood, there are all kinds of fun things that occur. Your body will not work like you want it to. It will do what it wants to, when it wants to, if it wants to. Life expectancy is continuing to increase. There is a significant gender gap between women and men, suggesting that women, more often than not, live much longer than men do. There is also a discrepancy between white and African Americans when it comes to life expectancy. That gap is closing. Generally speaking, African American individuals live shorter lifespans than white, but again, that gap is closing. The physical changes that result in later adulthood, use it or lose it. It boils down to keeping your body supple, being able to move it, exercise it, keep things moving along. If you want to sit down and do nothing, that's an option that's available to you as you age. If you do that, that's where you'll stay. I know more than one individual, some of them in my family. After the husband died, the wife sat down on the couch. Actually, she laid down on the couch, and she never got up. And as a result, her ability to walk faded significantly. She eventually broke both ankles at different times, spent time in a wheelchair. She was then moved into a facility to help care for her in an assisted capacity, not a nursing home, but in an assisted facility. And as a result, was walking using a walker because her physical strength had left her legs. And as a result, one evening she fell, shattered a shoulder. That shoulder was put back together again with screws. It continues to give her pain and other angst on a consistent basis. She has the physical capacity to walk about 30 feet. She is 80, 82-ish, give or take a year or so, and has been virtually immobile for a number of years. All of that began because she sat down and decided that she was no longer going to do whatever it was that was necessary to maintain any sort of physicality. Move your body. Certainly as you age, move things along or they quit working for you. Socially, when it comes to development, retirement can be a time of extreme stress, or in many cases, it becomes great fulfillment. It just depends. Just so you know, this won't be the prettiest picture that you get in your mind's eye today, but older adults can and usually do remain sexually active. Now, interestingly enough, if you read any of the research, you'll discover that they are active for different reasons, men and women. Again, that's for free. But men and women, even well up in age, tend to be at least somewhat sexually active. What they have to account for is longer time periods that are necessary to do whatever it is they want to do. Cognitive changes will occur as people age. The mental and physical activity will predict less cognitive decline. In other words, being active keeps your brain sharp. Some memory and reaction times will slow and create other deficits in general functioning. Alzheimer's disease is a difficult condition that is not manageable like you would hope. You can use your brain an awful lot, be extremely smart, and still develop Alzheimer's disease. Please remember that Alzheimer's disease is fatal. There is no cure that's currently known. The only way to formally diagnose Alzheimer's is through the autopsy, when they can actually cut open your head and look at the brain to decide for sure. Now, another aspect of living longer is that we will deal with the approach of death at some level. Now, there are what's called 5 stages of dying that are going to be referenced in your book. And what happens when individuals are confronted with the possibility of dying, their first stage they confront is denial. That's not happening to me. They do not believe that circumstance. Talk with someone who's been diagnosed with cancer and they'll tell you, I'm not going to die, I'm going to kick it, it's going to be fine. Once they get through the denial phase, they get very angry. Why is this happening to me? The third stage is bargaining. They start having conversations with God and they say to themselves, if I can live longer, I will do X, Y, and Z. They bargain. Depression comes next, when they move into a darker place of better understanding that death is coming. And then they eventually move into a place of acceptance where they become much more peaceful and they are able to manage the fact that their death is oncoming. I've been in a number of situations with individuals who are preparing to cross over, is what I would call it. They're in the process of dying, or from a conscious perspective are probably not really that conscious, but their bodies just haven't caught up with the rest of them yet. I've worked with families in contexts like that. It can be a very rewarding circumstance when individuals are okay with the fact that they're going to die. Life is much easier. If they fight, if they're still in denial or angry or bargaining or still depressed as it relates to that, then certain family difficulties arise. Individuals, if they are not able to maneuver through their relationships as effectively. I have not ever come across anyone who would look at me and make me believe I am ready to die. Nah, none of us is ready to die. There's always going to be something that we are interested in taking care of. Now, the reality is still the fact that at some point we're going to die, and we just have to manage that for what it is. Now, again, this particular chapter is a ginormous scattershot of lifespan development. I haven't hit hardly anything when it comes to human development, how things go. I will load up as best I'm able some video for you that gives you some access to other experiments and things that are referenced in this particular chapter. If I can help you with anything, please, again, don't hesitate to let me know.